I am the true Queen of Scotland, and I die a Catholic.
There are deaths that end in silence, and deaths that end in blood. But the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, did neither. Hers was a death that lingered. She was executed with 3 swings of an axe, buried once in haste and again in glory. Yet even in death, her body refused to rest. The woman who had once worn 3 crowns, Scotland, France, and England, at least in name, was turned into a political problem long after her heart had stopped beating. Where she died was not where she was buried, and where she was buried was not where she remained. Her body was moved, hidden, uncovered, paraded, and finally entombed again. But even then, it was not alone. What kind of queen is buried twice? And why does her coffin still make the living uneasy? This is not just the story of a tragic royal. This is the story of a corpse that became a symbol, a secret, and a curse. It began with hesitation. Queen Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, took nearly 2 months to sign the death warrant for her cousin Mary. The hesitation was not from mercy, but from fear. Fear of executing an anointed queen. Fear of political backlash. Fear that someday the same could be done to her. But the Babington plot, an alleged Catholic conspiracy to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, left her with little room to maneuver. The ciphered letters had been decoded. The evidence was damning. Parliament demanded blood. And so the warrant was signed. Mary received the news of her impending execution the night before. She was due to die. She did not weep or beg. She simply asked for time to pray and to write her final letters. One of them was sent to Henry III of France, in which she declared herself a martyr to her faith. A queen betrayed. A woman condemned not for crime, but for bloodline and belief. That night, her ladies helped her prepare not just for death, but for spectacle. She dressed carefully in black satin, the color of mourning, with a crimson underskirt and sleeves, symbolizing the passion and the blood of Christ. She wore a crucifix, held a rosary, and covered her hair with a white veil. She had chosen to die not as a traitor, but as a Catholic saint. At around 8 o'clock the next morning, on a cold February day, Mary was led into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. It had been transformed into an execution chamber, draped in black, with a low wooden scaffold, a small block, and a cushion to kneel on. The room was packed with noblemen, judges, soldiers, and spies, some to witness justice, some to measure its cost. 2 masked executioners stood ready. As she climbed the scaffold, Mary clutched her crucifix and her prayer book. She knelt gracefully, her back straight, her head high. She spoke to the crowd, denying involvement in the plot, asserting her innocence, her royalty, and her faith. Her final words were spoken in Latin, in manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. They were the same words spoken by Christ on the cross. Then the axe fell. The first blow missed her neck entirely, slicing into the back of her head. A wave of horror passed through the room. The second blow was closer, but still not enough. It was the third swing that finally severed her head from her shoulders. The executioner lifted it by the hair and cried, "God save the Queen." But then something grotesque happened. The hair came away in his hand. Mary had been wearing a wig. Her real hair, gray and cropped close, was slick with blood. Her head fell from his grasp and rolled across the scaffold. Her ladies screamed. Even the officials, hardened by years of state-sanctioned violence, were shaken, and beneath the folds of her blood-stained dress, a small movement, a whimper. Herr Dog, a Skye Terrier, had been hiding at her feet the entire time. It had refused to leave her and had crept with her to the block. When the execution was over, the dog was found curled against her body, its fur soaked in her blood. It had to be dragged away. After the killing, the authorities stripped her body. They were afraid her clothes might become relics for Catholic sympathizers. Everything she had worn was burned. Her body was embalmed in coarse cloth, wrapped in layers of linen, soaked in spices and vinegar, then sealed inside a lead coffin. But even in death, there was no dignity. Her body was not buried immediately. It was left in a side room of the same castle where she had died for over 5 months. It wasn't until late July of the year 1587 that she was finally laid to rest. And even that was contested. She was a queen. Yes, but also a convicted traitor. In the Tudor era, traitors were often displayed on spikes, their heads rotting above the gates of London. But Mary was spared this fate. Instead, her body was brought in solemn procession to Peterborough Cathedral. There, an old man known only as Old Scarlet, the cathedral sexton, said to be in his 90s, dug the grave. It was not a vault, not a crypt, not even lined with stone, just a deep hole in the earth, near the high altar. Her coffin was lowered in, and the dean read a simple funeral service. Then each officer present broke their staff in two and threw the pieces onto her coffin, sealing her fate in silence. But it wasn't over. 25 years passed. Queen Elizabeth died. James, the son of Mary and heir to both England and Scotland, ascended the throne, and almost immediately, he ordered the exhumation of his mother's body. A new tomb was to be built at Westminster Abbey, grand and towering, a monument worthy of a queen. But to place a queen in it, her remains had to be moved. And so, in the year 1612, her first grave was opened. The stone was removed. The dirt was dug. Her coffin was lifted and placed on a carriage bound for London. The Queen was on the move again. Today, she lies in Westminster Abbey beneath an effigy carved in marble. Her tomb is fast, regal, and seemingly at peace. But the truth is less serene. Her vault is crowded. Too many bodies lie in too little space. When her coffin was last inspected, it was said to be in a poor state. Its leads splitting, its contents crumbling from decay. So the question remains, what does it mean when, even in death, the crown does not protect you? What kind of queen is buried twice, mourned once, and forgotten in between? Mary, Queen of Scots, never truly left the stage. Not when the axe fell, not when the earth closed above her, not even when history tried to move on. It was not a sword, nor a dagger, nor even a poisoned goblet that brought death to Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a pen, or more precisely, it was the ink from her own hand. The soft strokes of Latin and French written in secrecy, the delicate bends of her signature, and the betrayals nestled between the lines of what she believed were private letters. Her downfall was not sealed on the battlefield, but in parchment and cipher, in the desperate hope that words could be trusted when kingdoms could not. She did not know, or perhaps she knew and dared anyway, that every syllable she wrote would be twisted into evidence, every flourish of her pen transformed into a noose around her throat. In the end, It was not treason that killed her. It was the interpretation of her intent. Mary had always been surrounded by letters. As a child raised in the French court, she learned early that correspondence was not only a tool of statecraft, but also an art of survival. The daughter of a doomed dynasty, a widow before 20, and a queen whose crown was as contested as her faith, she had long relied on the written word to craft alliances, arrange marriages, soothe enemies, and inflame loyalties. But as the years wore on and her freedom narrowed to the walls of an English castle, those letters became her only weapon and, unknown to her, her most fatal one. By the time Mary arrived in England in the year 1568, she was already a fugitive queen, driven out of Scotland after a scandal that had consumed her reign and left her name tangled in suspicion. Her second husband, Henry Darnley, had been murdered, strangled, and blown up. No less, and though Mary was never proven guilty, the scandal clung to her like smoke. Her third marriage, to the man widely believed to be involved in Darnley's death, only deepened the doubts. The Scottish nobles turned on her, imprisoned her, forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son James, and sent her fleeing across the border into England, seeking protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. But Elizabeth was not eager to protect her. She saw in Mary not a guest, but a rival, a Catholic claimant to her Protestant throne, a focus of foreign plots and domestic conspiracies, a queen with too many supporters and too many claims, and so Mary was not given the welcome she expected. Instead, she was taken into custody. She would spend the next 19 years not as a guest, but as a prisoner, though never in chains, always in castles, always under the polite name of protective custody, always surrounded by servants and walls and men with swords. Still, even a cage with golden bars is a cage. And Mary longed, not just for freedom, but for power. She longed for a crown, not the memory of the Scottish one, but the promise of the English one. Her claim was not weak. She was the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. By blood, she had a royal English lineage that many Catholics, at home and abroad, considered more legitimate than Elizabeth's. And so, in the shadows of England's castles, the letters began again. Letters to Spain, to France, to Rome, to Catholic allies and loyalists, to bishops and princes and old friends still burning with ambition. And then came Anthony Babington. He was young, passionate, reckless, and full of fire. A devout Catholic and English gentleman, Babington had long harbored dreams of rescuing the imprisoned Mary, placing her on the English throne, and restoring the old faith. But unlike other dreamers, Babington had a plan, or at least, he believed he did. He gathered a circle of like-minded conspirators, arranged for foreign support, and, crucially, opened a secret line of communication to Mary herself. It was not enough to free her. He needed her blessing, her approval, her authority, and so he wrote. The letters were not passed openly. They were smuggled through servants, hid in bear barrels, sewn into clothes, concealed behind wax seals, and passed under false names. And Mary responded, whether out of desperation, trust, or careful calculation. She wrote back. Her replies were cautious but warm, supportive without being overt, clever enough to conceal direct involvement, but not clever enough. Because someone was watching. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's Secretary of State and her spy master, had built an empire of intelligence, a master of codes and counterplots. Walsingham had infiltrated every court, every whisper, every secret chamber. He knew that something was stirring around Mary. And so he set the trap. He allowed the letters to pass, but intercepted everyone. He read them, studied them, copied them, and when he was ready, he showed them to Elizabeth. What happened next was not an immediate descent into execution, but a careful and public march toward it. Elizabeth, ever calculating, needed to be convinced. She did not want to be the first monarch to execute another crowned sovereign. She feared the backlash, the international condemnation, the possibility that she would be seen not as a queen defending her throne, but as a murderer eliminating her cousin. But Walsingham, with his stack of letters and decoded plans, pressed the point. One letter, dated July of the year 1586, would seal Mary's fate. In it, she appeared to approve the plot to assassinate Elizabeth. The phrasing was vague, but damning. Let the great enterprise go forward. She had written, whether she truly meant murder or merely rebellion is a question that still haunts historians. But for Walsingham and Parliament, it was enough. A commission was formed. Mary was tried, not in a court of peers, but by a panel of lords already convinced of her guilt. She protested that she was not an English subject, that she had no duty to obey English laws. It did not matter. The verdict was never in question. She was sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated once more. For weeks, she refused to sign the warrant. Her advisors grew impatient. Parliament grew furious. And finally, in February of the year 1587, she relented. The warrant was signed, the axe was sharpened, and Mary, Queen of Scots, began her final hours. But the question remains, what did Mary truly intend? Did she knowingly participate in a plot to assassinate her cousin, or was she manipulated, tricked by forged letters and a network of spies who shaped her fate before she ever held a pen? Was her correspondence genuine or tampered with? Did she dare hope that the words she wrote could free her, when in fact they only bound her tighter? What is certain is this: her letters were real. Her seal was found. Her words were presented as truth. And once they were read in the halls of power, there was no going back. She died because of them. Not because she picked up a sword. Not because she rallied an army. Not because she set foot on a battlefield. But because she wrote words. Words that others chose to fear. And long after her death, those same letters would continue to haunt her. Some would be published, others suppressed. Historians would argue over their meaning, their authenticity, their intent, but no one would argue that they had changed history. In the end, Mary did not die alone. She died with ink on her hands and secrets in her heart. She died not just for the crown she lost, but for the words she wrote trying to reclaim it. And as the next chapter unfolds, we return to that blood-stained scaffold, where 3 swings of the axe would do what years of war and exile could not silence the voice of a queen. But only for a moment, because her story, like her body, refused to stay buried. The morning of February the 8th, in the year 1587, began not with birdsong, nor with bells, nor with the soft clatter of servants preparing the daily meal. It began instead with silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, suspended in the stone walls of a castle that knows what is about to happen. Fotheringhay had seen many things in its long history: feasts, births, betrayals, but this morning, it waited to witness death. A death unlike any other. A queen would be executed that day. And no matter how calmly the state called it justice, the air was thick with something no law could explain. Dread. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had not slept. Not really. She had prayed through the night, dressed with care, spoken with grace, and prepared herself like a woman who had long accepted the betrayal of the living but refused to let it follow her into death. Her choice of garments had not been accidental. Nothing about Mary ever was. She wore black, the color of mourning, with a crimson undergown, a shroud of blood hidden beneath regal sorrow. She carried a crucifix in her hand, rosary beads at her waist, and a dignity so unshakable it made those who had condemned her wonder, even then, if they had made a mistake. At 8 o'clock, the door to her chamber opened. Outside, the men were already gathered, soldiers in stiff uniforms with trembling hands, noblemen who did not meet each other's eyes, judges whose robes were heavy with guilt. They had come to oversee the act, not just of execution, but of erasure, a silencing, a sealing off, a removal of threat disguised as ritual. As she stepped out, Mary's ladies-in-waiting struggled to contain their tears. She, by contrast, walked with the calm of a woman who had nothing left to prove. Her back was straight, her lips moved in silent prayer, and as she descended the stairwell and turned toward the great hall, the atmosphere shifted. The room had been transformed. A scaffold had been built hastily in the center, raised high and cloaked in black, as if to mimic the solemnity of a theater stage, though no one dared call it performance. A low wooden block stood at the center of the platform, beside a small cushion on which the condemned might kneel. Draped around it were heavy curtains, hiding nothing but attempting, in vain, to soften the truth. The great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, once a place for banquets and courtly music, now reeked of death. 2 men in black stood waiting, masked executioners, their faces concealed not out of shame, but to preserve a ritual anonymity. Beside them, Sir Amias Paulet, her jailer, and the Earl of Shrewsbury, the official witness, stood stiffly, their posture rigid with duty. Every person in the room felt the same impossible contradiction, that they were both watching something intimate and something monstrous. Mary was helped onto the scaffold, her crucifix still in her hand. She looked out over the crowd and addressed them with a voice clear and calm. She declared herself innocent of any plot to kill Elizabeth. She spoke not as a criminal, but as a sovereign, invoking her faith, her blood, of her dignity. She said she died as a Catholic, as a queen, and as a woman wrongfully condemned. The silence after her words was not reverent, it was stunned. Then came the moment of surrender. She knelt. The cushion was soft beneath her knees, the block cold beneath her neck. One of her women approached to tie the blindfold, but Mary gently declined. She would do it herself. Her hands trembled only slightly as she fastened the cloth over her eyes. She stretched out her arms, palms open, as if offering herself to heaven. Her lips still moved, whispering the final prayers. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. And then the axe came down. The first blow was not clean. It struck not her neck, but the back of her head, sending a splatter of blood across the black fabric and causing a horrified gasp to ripple through the onlookers. It was not supposed to happen like this. This was a queen, This was supposed to be quick, ceremonial, almost sacred in its finality. Instead, the executioner faltered, and the second blow, though closer to the mark, still did not finish what he had started. It was only the third swing that fully severed her head from her body. The silence that followed was unnatural, as if the very walls refused to echo the sound. The executioner raised her head high and called out, "God save the Queen." But even this attempt at state theater unraveled instantly, for as he held the head aloft, the auburn hair he grasped came away in his hand. It was a wig, real hair, thinned and gray from years of confinement and grief. Slipped free, the head fell from his hands and thudded wetly onto the scaffold. It rolled slightly, blood seeping into the grain of the wood. And in that moment, the illusion shattered. She was not just a queen. She was a woman. She was flesh and bone and blood. And she was gone. The sound that came from her ladies-in-waiting was not human. It was a cry torn from the deepest place of grief, of helpless rage, of horror at the spectacle that had just unfolded. Even the officials, who had come prepared for this, stood paralyzed. Their faces were pale. Some turned away. One man wretched behind a curtain, and for a few seconds, no one moved. And then movement. A twitch beneath the hem of her dress. A faint, whimpering sound. From beneath the folds of black and red silk, a small creature emerged. It was Mary's dog, a Skye Terrier, that had hidden beneath her skirts. Silent and loyal to the very end, the animal, now soaked in her blood, refused to leave her body. When guards approached to remove it, it snarled and whimpered, its small frame shaking. It had to be dragged away. It would not let go. Even after her death, the rituals continued. Her clothes were stripped from her body, not for dignity, but for fear. Fear that they might be collected as relics by Catholic sympathizers. Her crucifix and rosary were confiscated. Her garments burned. Her body, naked and violated, was washed, embalmed with spices and cloth, and sealed in a lead coffin. But no one wanted to bury her. No one wanted to claim her. For over 5 months, the coffin remained in a side chamber of the castle. Neither queen nor traitor. Neither honored nor forgotten. What took place that day in the great hall of Fotheringhay was not justice. It was theater without catharsis. Punishment without peace. The state had attempted to end a threat, but instead had created a martyr. Her death had not extinguished her power. It had transformed it. Her blood had stained more than the scaffold. It had seeped into the memory of a nation. And in the end, the attempt to erase her only ensured that she would never be forgotten. Because you can silence a voice, but you cannot silence the sound it leaves behind. Because you can bury a queen, but you cannot bury what she meant. Because even as the doors of that great hall were sealed, and the blood was scrubbed from the wood, and the curtains were taken down, and the mask of civility restored, something had shifted. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed, but she had not been erased. Not yet, and as the story continues, we will follow her again, through her funeral, that was never fit for a queen, through the journey of her body across cities and years, through the second grave that was meant to redeem the first, and through the legacy she left behind, like footprints in blood. Because some queens die once, but Mary died twice, and neither time did it bring her peace. After the axe had done its work, and the crowd began to disperse like shadows at sunrise, the great hall of Fotheringhay did not immediately return to stillness. There are silences that comfort, and there are silences that accuse. What lingered in the air that morning was the second kind, thick, unrelenting, as if the very stones of the castle had absorbed the horror and refused to let it go. The blood had not yet dried on the wooden boards of the scaffold, and yet men were already speaking in whispers, their voices trembling with something they could not name. Was it remorse, or awe, or simply the aftershock of witnessing something that had come far too close to being sacred, only to end in something grotesque? Her body remained on the platform longer than expected. The executioners, unsure what to do next, waited for orders that did not come. Her ladies were frozen in grief, unable to approach, unable to look away. The room, for a few haunting minutes, became a space where time felt suspended, where duty clashed with conscience, and where the weight of history had come crashing down in a way none of them could have rehearsed. It had all gone wrong. The botched first blow, the severed head rolling from the scaffold, the wig peeling away like a cruel final indignity, and most of all, the small creature that refused to leave her side. It was the dog, more than the blood, that unsettled the men the most. They had expected many things that morning: prayers, screams, the sound of steel against flesh, but none had expected a tiny Skye Terrier, white-furred and shaking, to emerge from beneath the folds of Mary's gown after her head had fallen. The animal had remained hidden throughout, curled into her petticoats as if trying to shield itself from the inevitable. No one had seen it enter the scaffold. No one had thought to search her skirts. And yet there it was, now, refusing to budge, its small body pressed against the side of hers, its eyes dark with terror and confusion. Blood had matted its fur. It trembled, but did not flee. Servants tried to coax it away. It snapped. Guards moved to remove it. It growled and whimpered. At last, one man approached and forcibly tore it from the lifeless form of the woman it had served so loyally. The dog struggled in his arms, twisting, scratching, trying to return to the only home it had ever known: the scent, the warmth. Now gone. They say animals understand death. But what the terrier understood that day, no one could say. Only that it had seen the unseeable, and that it would never forget. In the hours that followed, Mary's body was stripped, not by her women, not gently, not with reverence. The state feared relics, feared that even a fragment of fabric touched by a Catholic queen might spark rebellion, might be secreted away by a loyal hand, might be placed under a pillow or stitched into a bodice as a sign of resistance. And so her clothing was burned, her crucifix, her rosary, her veil, all taken. She was examined, embalmed, and placed into a lead coffin, as if the metal could contain the meaning of her death. But there was no procession, no mass, no bell tolling across the countryside to announce the passing of a monarch. There was only silence. And then the waiting began. Her coffin, heavy and sealed, was not moved. Not yet. For 5 long months. It remained inside, Fotheringhay Castle, hidden, ignored. An inconvenient reminder of a woman they had tried to erase. She had been a queen. And yet, she was treated like a problem. Something to be stored until it became politically safe to deal with her again. The room where her coffin was kept became a place no one liked to visit. Servants spoke of unease, of coldness, even in summer, of dreams disturbed, and candles that would not stay lit. Perhaps it was superstition. Perhaps not. Outside, the world moved on. Elizabeth continued to reign, though never quite easily again. There were celebrations. Of course, some believed the execution had saved the realm, but beneath the pageantry, there was unease. Foreign ambassadors questioned the act. Catholics grieved in silence, or plotted in whispers. And in Scotland, young King James received news of his mother's death with what appeared to be calm detachment. Though some say he wept behind closed doors. He said nothing publicly. Not yet. Not for years. When they finally decided to bury her, it was not in London. Not in the heart of England. But in Peterborough Cathedral, far from court. Far from politics. Far from the places where her name had stirred too much fire. An old man known only as Old Scarlet was summoned to dig her grave. They say he was nearly 100 years old, and that he had dug hundreds of graves in his time, but never one for a queen. There was no vault, no marble, no royal tomb, just a pit, deep and unadorned, carved into the earth, near the altar. Her coffin was brought in with little ceremony. The dean spoke a brief service. The officers present broke their staffs and tossed them into the grave. The earth swallowed the scandal, but not for long. Even in burial, Mary did not find peace. The grave they gave her was not meant to be permanent. 25 years later, after the death of Elizabeth, her son James ascended to the throne of England, and at last took the opportunity to reclaim the mother he had never truly known. He ordered her body exhumed and transferred to Westminster Abbey, to be reburied as a queen should be, beneath a monument of stone and dignity. Yet before that could happen, before she was given her second grave, her body had to be lifted again into the light. The coffin was dug from the earth, hoisted onto a carriage, and paraded through the countryside as if in penance. No one knew what they would find when they opened the first grave, but many feared it. A quarter-century underground, embalmed or not, could not preserve what had already been broken. And though they claimed the transfer was noble, though they built her a tomb that gleamed with the pride of a kingdom trying to rewrite its sins, something about the act felt hollow, because a second grave does not undo the first, because marble cannot cleanse blood from wood, and because even today, the bloodstains on the scaffold are gone, the cloth burned, the hall repurposed, but the story remains. Mary's dog, it is said, lived a short time after Rady. No one is sure what became of it. Some say it refused to eat. Some say it wandered the castle halls, searching for her. Others say it died of grief. Curled in the same posture, it had taken on the scaffold floor. We remember the queen, but perhaps we should also remember the dog, because in that moment, small, shaking, unwilling to let her go, it was the only creature in the room that loved her. And in the end, perhaps that is the most human thing of all. There are funerals that ring out like a final bell, clarifying everything that came before, processions that part crowds, incense that rises into vaulted ceilings, choirs that sing not for the dead, but for the memory they leave behind. These are the funerals of kings, of saints, of those whose deaths are treated as summits of legacy, whose bodies are mourned, not just by the living, but by the world itself. Mary, Queen of Scots, had no such funeral. Hers was not a farewell. It was a postponement, a burial conducted in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for all the wrong reasons. It was not an act of honor. It was a political obligation. No one knew how to perform. She had been dead for over 5 months when they finally moved her coffin. Embalmed in haste. Sealed in lead. Her body had rested in isolation within the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, unvisited, unspoken of, a problem deferred. During that time, no bell had tolled for her. No official court mourning had been declared. She had been a queen. Yes, but also a condemned traitor. And in that contradiction lay the root of all indecision. To bury her as a monarch would be to legitimize her claim, to honor her as an equal to Elizabeth. To treat her as a criminal would be to risk backlash from Catholic Europe, to invite questions of justice. And so, for 150 days, nothing was done. Finally, a decision was made quiet, strategic, and safely distant. Her body would be buried at Peterborough Cathedral, a place of dignity but not prominence, far from Westminster, far from the sight of the court, and far from the crowds that might interpret the funeral as either martyrdom or shame. The selection was deliberate. Peterborough had once received another discarded queen, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, cast aside for failing to bear a son and buried without fanfare. Now, it would host another woman whose crown had become a curse, whose bloodline had challenged England's throne, and whose death had been whispered about more than it had been mourned. The journey to Peterborough was somber but not grand. There were no masses lining the roads, no black-cloaked dignitaries or velvet-draped carriages, just a coffin of lead, transported on a grey skis. Guarded by silence, the procession moved through quiet fields and sleeping towns, watched not by loyal subjects, but by shadows and fog. When it arrived at the cathedral, the bells did not ring out in peals of sorrow. They struck once, then fell silent. The dean received the body with the formal coldness of a man who had not been given time to grieve. Only instructions to follow. The man chosen to dig her grave was not a court servant or royal undertaker, but a local sexton, an old figure, known to the townsfolk as Old Scarlet. He was said to be nearing 100 years of age, his hands gnarled from decades of soil and stone, his eyes dulled, not by blindness, but by the kind of vision that had seen too much. He had buried hundreds, perhaps more noblemen, paupers, soldiers, infants, and now, at the twilight of his life, he was called upon to bury a queen. There was no fanfare when he dug the grave, just the creak of the spade, the crumble of earth, and the quiet labor of a man whose work, though humble, would outlast the ceremony itself. The grave was not a vault. It was not a marble tomb or a crypt carved in Latin and gold. It was a deep pit, unlined and plain, carved into the earth near the south choir aisle, close to but not beside the high altar. She would not rest among the monarchs. She would not lie in a place where future generations would look upon her effigy and remember her story. Instead, she would be placed in a corner, across from the body of Catherine of Aragon, as if the cathedral had become a resting place for the inconvenient women of Tudor history. On the day of the funeral, the cathedral was not full. There was no national mourning, no assembled clergy from across the kingdom, no procession of foreign ambassadors in black. A handful of officers stood at attention, fulfilling roles assigned by the state rather than by conscience. The Dean of Peterborough read the service from the Book of Common Prayer, Anglican words over a Catholic soul. Mary had died for her faith. And now, even in burial, her beliefs were denied. There was no Latin Mass, no incense, no requiem sung by weeping choirs, just English scripture echoing off cold stone, spoken by men who did not know her. When the final words faded beneath the vaulted ceiling, each officer present stepped forward and raised his staff. It was the Tudor tradition, a signal that their service to the dead had ended. In unison, they broke their staffs in two and dropped them into the grave, onto the coffin, where the sound of splintering wood met the soft thud of finality. Then came the soil, the covering, the patting down, and she was gone. But even as the earth settled, those who watched could not escape the feeling that this was not the end, that something had been left unfinished, that a silence had been layered over what should have been a roar. They had buried a queen like a criminal, with no crown, no coat of arms, no procession of mourners, and in doing so, had tried to bury the controversy, the danger, the story. But graves are not vaults for secrets. They are reminders, and this one, shallow though it was, held a memory too vast to stay underground. For 25 years, Mary's name was not spoken aloud in court. Her grave was not visited. Her story remained a discomfort, lodged in the throat of the English monarchy. Elizabeth continued her reign, aging into legend, but never truly escaping the shadow of the cousin she had condemned. And James, Mary's son, who had taken the throne of Scotland as a child and now ruled England, after Elizabeth's death, grew into a man torn between two mothers, the one who raised him from afar with letters soaked in longing, and the one who raised the sword that ended her. When James came to power, the silence cracked. He ordered that his mother's body be moved to Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings and queens. And there, finally, a proper tomb would be built. But that is another story. This was the funeral she was given, not the one she deserved, but the one they allowed. A queen buried without a crown, a mother buried without her son, a soul buried without peace. And for those who stood among the pews that day, hearing the dry cadence of scripture echo through the cathedral, it was clear that what they were witnessing was not an ending, but a pause in a story that refused to die. Because Mary, Queen of Scots, had always lived in between nations, between faiths, between love and betrayal, and now, even in death, she remained suspended between honor and shame, between silence and legend. They covered her with earth, but they could not cover what she meant. By the time they called for him, his hands were already stained with a lifetime of soil. His shoulders bowed not from defeat, but from the slow weight of years spent carrying the dead. They called him Old Scarlet, as if age had consumed his name, as if time had worn down the letters, until only the ghost of a man remained. He was, by most accounts, nearing 100 years old when the order arrived, not a royal summons, not a trumpet blare request, but a quiet message passed through cathedral hands. A grave was needed for a queen, and not just any queen, but one who had lost her crown in life and was not certain to regain it in death. He did not ask questions. He had buried too many people to believe in the fairness of endings. Kings and commoners, children and soldiers, the faithful and the damned. He had dug graves for all of them, and the earth had made no distinction. But this grave was different. It came with whispers, with silence, with a coffin brought under cover of cloud and hesitation. There was no procession, no velvet drapery, no black banners fluttering in the wind, just the arrival of lead and secrecy, and a woman inside it, whose name was spoken only behind closed doors. Old Scarlet had seen her before once, long ago. When she was alive, he had watched her ride through the countryside, her head held high, her bearing unshaken even by exile. She had passed him without noticing, but he had noticed her. There was something strange in that memory now, something unnerving in knowing that the woman whose image had once cut through the fog like a sword was now a sealed body beneath a pane of lead. And he, the man no one ever looked at twice, had been chosen to dig the final place she would rest. He took up his spade as he always did, though his fingers curled more slowly around the handle, and the soil no longer yielded to him with the same ease. He began in the early light, when the dew still clung to the stones of the cathedral, and no one was awake to witness his labor. He worked alone. There was no apprentice, no procession of assistants or pallbearers, just the old man and the pit that deepened with every hour. The silence only broken by the rhythm of shovel meeting earth, and the slow settling of dust upon his boots. It was not a royal vault. He dug no marble-lined crypt, no resting place worthy of a sovereign. It was a hole, deep, yes, respectful in depth, perhaps, but simple, plain, unworthy of the stories that clung to the woman it would soon hold. He wondered what she would have thought of it, whether she, who had lived surrounded by pageantry, who had been a queen in 3 realms, would have recognized herself in this moment. No crown, no scepter, no choir, just a box and an old man, and the dirt slowly rising around them both. When the coffin arrived, he was already waiting. He did not flinch at the sight of it. Lead was heavy, but he had carried heavier. What struck him most was not the weight of the coffin, but the weightlessness of the ritual. There was no crying, no wailing courtier, no son draped in black, just the clergy, the officials, and the echo of a burial no one truly wanted to attend. The dean read from the Book of Common Prayer. The words fell flat, like stones in water, rippling outward but sinking quickly. It was a Protestant service for a Catholic queen, a legal farewell for a political corpse. Not a soul in the cathedral believed it was enough. And yet old Scarlet stood still through all of it. He listened to the words. He watched the faces. He took in the silence that fell when the dean closed the book, and the strange ritual that followed, the officers stepping forward one by one, snapping their staffs in half and throwing them into the grave. A symbolic end to their service, and perhaps to her story. The sound of wood breaking lingered in the air, loud in a way that Scripture had not been. Then they turned and walked away, as if their duty had ended, as if the earth now belonged to her and not to them. But Scarlet stayed behind. He waited until the others had gone. He stared down at the coffin, at the fractured wood lying atop it, and then at the dirt piled beside him. For a long moment, he said nothing. And then, without ceremony, he began to shovel. It took hours. The pit was deep, and his limbs no longer worked as they once had. But he did not hurry. He let the rhythm guide him. Let the weight of each scoop settle into his spine. He covered the coffin slowly, gently, as if the act of burial could somehow rewrite what had come before. Each layer of earth felt like a page closing on the girl who had once ruled France, on the queen who had been crowned in Scotland, on the prisoner who had walked to her death in silence. He buried them all, not just the body, but the history. And when the last handful of soil was in place, and he stood above the grave and whispered something no one heard. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a confession, or perhaps he simply said her name aloud. For the first time in days, unafraid. Mary. Then he turned and walked away. In time, he would dig more graves. He would bury more strangers. He would be remembered in Peterborough for his service, his longevity, even his portrait painted in cathedral robes, forever watching over the tombs he helped fill. But of all the names he buried, this one would outlive them all. He had dug a grave for a queen, not the way they usually are dug, not the way they should be, but deep enough quiet enough, and with a kind of reverence that no title or church decree could command. And sometimes, when the winds curled around the cathedral walls just right, the story went, one could still see him in the early morning, an old man with a spade, standing near the stone that marked the place where they buried her the first time. Not the stone that bore her name, not the tomb they built for her later, far away in London, but the first place, the true place, the place where silence first tried to swallow her. But it never could, because some graves aren't meant to keep what they're given. And some queens, no matter how deeply buried, never really go. They buried her once, but not forever. The earth at Peterborough took her in reluctantly, with no anthem and no thunder. No royal choir and no crown laid gently across the lid of her coffin. For 25 years, Mary, Queen of Scots, lay beneath that cold cathedral floor, in a corner too quiet for history and too quiet for her name. But even stone cannot hold what time refuses to forget. Her first grave was never a resting place. It was a holding place, a pause in a story that would find its voice again not in grief, but in legacy. The years passed like pages in a closed book, their weight heavy, their silence deliberate. Above the ground, England changed. Elizabeth aged into myth, cloaked in pearls and symbolism, ruling longer than any monarch before her, yet always shadowed by the woman she had killed. And when death finally came for her in the spring of the year, 1603, she left behind no husband, no child, no heir of her own body, only the vacancy of a throne, and a question, who would rule next? And the answer came with a name Elizabeth had once feared to speak: James, son of Mary, king of both Scotland and now England, a child born from a marriage that had scandalized a kingdom, a boy who had been crowned while his mother still lived, taken from her arms and raised by men who taught him that her love was dangerous and her politics worse. For years, he had ruled from the north, watching England from a distance, knowing his claim was written in blood, but stalled by fear. And now, with Elizabeth gone, that claim awakened like a dormant fire. The throne was his. No rebellion, no battle, just a crown that rolled toward him with inevitability. But with the crown came memory, and with memory came responsibility. It did not happen immediately. For a while, James focused on peace. He soothed old wounds. He united courts. He wore his new authority like a mask, carefully molded to fit a divided kingdom. But beneath the diplomacy, the presence of his mother hovered like a question never asked aloud. She was buried far from where she belonged. Her tomb was modest, her grave barely marked, her story half buried in Protestant shame. And James, for all his pragmatism, could not ignore the dissonance. She had died dishonored, but she had died a queen, and queens, even in death, deserve their crown. So he gave the order. She would be moved, exhumed from the quiet shadows of Peterborough and brought to Westminster Abbey, where monarchs slept in stone, and history was carved in Latin above their heads. A new tomb would be built large, ornate, crowned in white marble, watched over by angels. Her name engraved, not in whisper, but in permanence. It would take time. It would take labor. It would take the reopening of a grave the kingdom had long tried to forget. And so they opened it. It had been 25 years since the dirt had closed around her. The grave was dug again. This time, not by an old man in silence, but by order of the crown. They removed the stones carefully, peeled back the soil with reverence, The lead coffin was still there, dull with age, heavier than memory. No one spoke as it was lifted. No one dared to guess what lay within. Had time been kind to her? Had the spices held back decay? Or had the silence of decades consumed even the body? They did not open it. Some things, even kings, choose not to see. They placed the coffin onto a carriage, covered it in cloth, and began the journey south. This time, there were guards. There were roads cleared. There were orders issued that she be treated not as a prisoner or a problem, but as a queen returning home. Yet still, the procession did not echo with public mourning. There were no crowds gathered along the path, no floral offerings thrown at her wheels. England had not learned how to grieve her. It only knew how to move her. When they reached Westminster, preparations had already begun. The Abbey, ancient and vast, held the dust of generations, the breath of kings and saints, the secrets of 1,000 funerals. A new vault had been carved beneath the floor. A monument sculpted with exquisite detail was nearing completion. Mary in repose, robed in state, hands folded over her chest, her face serene in marble, far calmer than it had ever been in life. They lowered her into that final vault with care. No shattered staffs, no broken ceremony. This was not a Tudor burial, it was a Stuart correction. A rewriting, not of history, but of the way history had been remembered. Her coffin was placed beside the remains of her kin, among monarchs who had never feared her name. And above her, her tomb rose like a vindication not just for her, but for James, who had turned scandal into sovereignty, loss into symbol, and a mother's disgrace into a nation's repentance. Still, even there, even in the Grand Abbey, her rest was not quite her own. Years later, when her tomb was opened again for maintenance and review, the truth came to light. The vault was overcrowded. Others had been buried there, men and women, not of her blood, not of her legacy, not of her choosing. Her coffin, though sealed, had suffered from time and pressure. Its sides were collapsing, the lead buckling, the bones inside, unnamed, unprotected, slipping further into the anonymity of shared space. Even now, even beneath marble and angels, Mary did not lie alone. But perhaps that is how her story was always meant to be. Not solitary, not clean, not sealed with certainty, but layered, entangled, impossible to isolate from the mess of the world she once tried to rule. Her first grave had tried to hide her. Her second tried to enshrine her. Neither succeeded in containing her. Because Mary was never just a queen. She was a wound in the heart of a country. A ghost inside a crown. And even after 25 years of silence, her body had a way of finding its way back to the surface, not to accuse, not to reign, but to remind that every grave, no matter how deep or beautifully carved, is still only a pause. And that some stories, some women refuse to stay paused. They built her a tomb fit for legend, white marble, impossibly smooth, carved with the likeness of a queen who, in life, was rarely allowed to rest. Her hands, sculpted in prayer, her eyes closed in stone serenity, her gown falling in graceful folds across the cold slab, as if time had finally granted her the peace it had so long withheld. In Westminster Abbey, beneath the towering arches that caught light like a cathedral, catching its breath, Mary Stuart's name was etched in permanence. Queen of Scots, daughter of kings, mother of a dynasty, a martyr. Some whispered, a warning. Others believed, but above all, A queen, and yet below her, deep beneath that elegant monument, beyond the reach of reverent footsteps and choir songs, was a very different truth. There, hidden in the earth, was a vault not of solitude, but of accumulation, a cramped cavity beneath the abbey floor, packed beyond design, with the bodies of those whose names have been lost to dust, and record both. It was never supposed to be like this. But in the end, even queens can be misplaced. When the tomb was first built, it was intended to redeem her. It was a statement, a royal gesture from a son to a mother he could never defend in life. James had ordered the work with urgency, commissioning craftsmen to honor her memory, to lift her from the political disgrace of her first burial and place her among monarchs. It was a correction not just of history, but of silence. But time is not easily corrected, and cathedrals, no matter how holy, are governed not only by prayer, but by pressure, by space, by practicality. Years passed. Abbey floors shifted. Stone wore down. Burials continued. And one by one, new coffins were lowered into the same vault, until what had once been carved for a queen became crowded by strangers. Some were nobility, loosely tied to the court. Some were high-ranking clerics. Some were children of households whose names no longer appear in royal records. No one had planned for them to rest with her. But the abbey had limited space, and death waits for no architectural convenience. Over time, the vault became full, then overfull, and by the time the grave was opened again generations later, what they found shocked even those who had buried kings. The coffin was failing. Her lead shell, once sturdy, had buckled under the weight of years, and neighbors, the sides were caved in, the contents disturbed. The nameplate had worn soft, dulled by moisture and contact. Around here, other coffins leaned, split, collapsed into one another. Wood on wood, bone on bone. No clean separations, no noble divisions. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, whose death had shaken thrones, whose blood had turned courts against each other, now lay among the indistinct dead pressed in, crowded, anonymous. No royal ceremony had accompanied the newcomers. No declaration had marked their descent into her vault. They had arrived quietly, and remained even more so. Those who opened the grave centuries later could not identify them all. Some records had been lost. Others had never been kept. What was clear, though, was that Mary's second resting place had been shared unwillingly, perhaps unknowingly, and that even in her most honored grave, she had never truly been alone. And so the irony of her story completed itself. She had lived surrounded by enemies, died watched by strangers, buried first in haste, then in marble, and yet in neither place was she granted the one thing she had longed for most, a space of her own. Her life had been filled with political entanglements, romantic betrayals, religious battles, and endless negotiations over her place in the world. And now, even in death, the question of place remained unresolved. Some queens are remembered by their tombs. Mary's tomb remembers her imperfectly. Walk through Westminster today, and you will find it. You may even stop to read her name, to admire the sculpture, to imagine her lying peacefully beneath the polished stone. But what lies beneath is not peace, it is compression. A lifetime of conflict pressed into lead. A death crowded by compromise. A queen surrounded by strangers. She was moved there in the name of honor. But no one returned to move the others. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. that no matter how finely a memory is carved, no matter how bright the marble or loud the redemption, what lies beneath may still betray it. Still, people visit. Still, they lay flowers. Still, some bow their heads and whisper apologies too late, too soft, too brief, because something about her story does not let go. It tugs at the hem of memory, asking why the world never made room for her. Not when she was born, not when she reigned, not when she died, and not even when she was buried twice. But perhaps that is the nature of her legend. Not one of rest, but of unrest. Not of stillness, but of stirring. Her grave, like her life, remains full of ghosts. And in the stone silence of Westminster Abbey, among the echoes of centuries, her tomb waits not for justice, not for vengeance, but for understanding. Even now, it waits. She had 3 crowns in her life, and not one of them brought her peace. The first was placed on her head when she was just 6 days old, a queen before she had learned to speak. A child born into a title heavy with prophecy and danger. The second she wore as the consort of France, a foreign bride, beloved and then widowed before she was grown. And the third crown, never quite touched her head. But it lived in the minds of those who whispered her name like a prayer, and in the fears of those who signed her death. Mary Stuart had the blood, the claim, the lineage, but the world around her, sharp with suspicion and bruised by war, could not find a place for her that did not involve choosing sides. And she was too royal to be ignored and too complicated to be forgiven. They tried to make her disappear. Not suddenly, not violently, not at first, but slowly. Through confinement, through letters intercepted, through years of quiet exile in castles, too far from court and too close to forgetting. They kept her alive for 19 years after her arrival in England. Not out of mercy, but out of fear. To kill a queen was to wound the divine, but to let her live was to invite chaos. And in the end, they chose the wound. Her death, when it came, was not clean. The axe took 3 strokes. Her hair came off with her head. Her dog refused to leave her side. Her ladies screamed. Her enemies flinched. And still, they called it justice. But justice does not tremble in its own courtroom. Justice does not apologize with marble years later. They buried her in haste. Then again in grandeur. And still again in silence, when strangers were laid beside her. They changed her location but not her fate. They gave her a tomb, but not the solitude she had been denied in life. They carved her image in stone. Eyes closed. Hands folded. A queen finally at rest. But even that image lies above a vault she never asked to share. Her monument says queen, but her grave says forgotten. And yet, she was never truly forgotten. Because Mary Stuart exists in the spaces between things, in the tension between religion and rule, between mother and monarch, between sinner and saint. She is not easily defined. She never was. Perhaps that is why history tried to silence her, not out of hatred, but exhaustion. It is easier to enshrine someone than to understand them, easier to reduce them to cautionary tale than to wrestle with the contradictions they leave behind. But bedtime stories are where contradictions belong. Not the sugary ones. Not the tidy ones. The long ones. The quiet ones. The ones that end with questions instead of lessons. And if you've come this far, then maybe you've already felt it, that tug just beneath the surface. That voice still whispering from under the abbey stones. Not asking to be praised or pitied, only to be remembered rightly. Because Mary was more than what they wrote on her tomb. She was a girl sent to marry before she had a choice. A queen who ruled a land that did not want her. A woman caught between empires. Between reformations. Between the trembling hands of men who called her dangerous simply because she would not yield. She was loved and betrayed. Adored and exiled. Raised high and brought down again. And through it all, she wrote letters to lovers, or to cousins, to kings. Words were her last weapon, and they were what finally condemned her. They took her head, but not her voice. It still echoes. In every quiet corner of every darkened cathedral, in the footsteps of women born into legacy they did not ask for. In the stories we tell about power and punishment and the price of being both regal and real, they buried her twice. But the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, never stayed buried. It lives in the marble, in the silence, in the blood memory of a crown that history once tried to hide. And now, perhaps, as you close your eyes and let the stillness settle, you'll remember her too, not as a martyr, not as a monster, but as a woman who never got to choose where she belonged, and who, even in death, is still waiting to be seen.